Welcome to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. Industry updates and best practice to promote, support, develop and protect the Scottish red meat sector.
Hello and thanks very much for downloading this podcast. I'm Mark Stephen. I'm a real fan of old BBC radio comedy, and way back when there used to be a programme called Round the Horn, and one of the regular characters in that was an old farmer called Arthur Fallowfield, played by the late great Kenneth Williams, who began answering any question you like on any subject with the words, "Well, I think the answer lies in the soil." Over 50 years on, that idea is still kicking around, but folk aren't laughing so much anymore. More and more farmers are realising that soil health is key, not just to productivity, but also to things like improved carbon sequestration. And the way things are going in farming at the moment, that might be money in the bank. Emily Grant is a sheep farmer with a master's degree in environmental management. She's also the founder of Forrit, a farming and consultancy business specialising in helping beef and sheep farmers identify opportunity within their business to improve productivity, profitability and sustainability by optimising output with minimum purchased inputs. Emily, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
Good stuff. And Alex Brewster farms 1,000 hectares at Rotmill Farm in Perthshire. He started experimenting with rotational grazing back in 2013, and that developed into a mob grazing system, which he says has brought about real improvements in the soil structure and rooting depths of plants. It's also increased the availability of nutrients, which in turn has led to better stock health and growth rates, and he can graze his beasts for longer. Last year, he was awarded the title of 2020 Livestock Soil Farmer of the Year. I know it's a bit late, Alex, but congratulations.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, it was a real honour and one of the, I think, absolute highlights of what we in the business have achieved to date. That was, I really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed it.
Good stuff. Now, I mean, the award is great, but I suspect folk listening to this will be more interested in that long list of benefits I mentioned. Where did your interest in soil begin?
I think when you're a son of the land, you always have an interest in soil. You know, from in the early days, ploughing, turning the soil over, keeping the furrows straight. All these basic bits of agriculture. And I always had a real love for that. And then when we got into rotational grazing, it became apparent that soil health and rooting depth, root architecture, plant health was very much linked to how biologically mobile your soils were. And over, I think, a period of time, I've just gradually drifted more and more into it. And every time we've had a problem or we've hit a bit of a barrier, and you start nutting out where the problem lies, you generally come back to something's not functioning correctly in the soil.
And what are the fundamentals of your system? What do you do?
We capture solar energy from the sun, and we capture as much of it as we possibly can through as diverse array of pastoral plants as we possibly can. We try and store a lot of the energy from that process into the soil through carbohydrates, and then we graze livestock in it. And the more nutritious I can make each mouthful of grass, the better livestock performance we get. And I'm becoming more and more aware that my primary function is maybe to feed the livestock within the soil, i.e. the microbes, more so than feeding the livestock above the soil, which are ultimately cash. They can be sold at any one point.
Emily, both you and Alex have been involved in something called the Rock on Soils project. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so Rock on Soils was, because we've actually just finished the project, was a farm innovation project which was funded through the Knowledge Transfer and Innovation Fund, which is basically Scottish Government and European funding for innovative projects on farm. It was a collaborative project working with scientists and farmers, and specifically looking at, Alex had been using basically something that we would consider to be quarry stour. So this crushed rock, a byproduct of quarrying industry, had been using that on farm, and it has potential to sequester inorganic carbon. So that seemed like a great opportunity to have a project to look at, well, are there wider benefits and how can we use this product as a way to help sequester carbon into agricultural soils?
So you put how much rock dust on how much land, Alex?
It varies. I ran a little bit of experiment. By nature, I'm slightly cynical. So if somebody tells me this is the panacea, I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to go and dabble around the edges and play with it a little bit and come to my own conclusions on it. So we took a 12-hectare paddock and split it into effectively 6. And the outsides, we spread it 5 tonne a hectare. The middle third was a 10 tonne a hectare. Then we doubled to 20 tonne a hectare in the middle of this field. And the idea was to anecdotally stand back and see if there's any major change in grazing pattern or perceived physical characteristics to the grass. Now, initially, I started working with the product because it carries quite a lot of trace elements. And we've been struggling, beef and sheep operations, there's always a limit. And one of our limits here on Rottmeiler is selenium, is the availability of selenium and cobalt. And that was challenging the sheep production system. And I was finding directly bolusing very ineffective. We do a lot of EID work, so we're able to benchmark a huge amount of information. And this was me having another stab at trying to rectify a trace element shortage in the soil initially. It then ran on to be far, far more. Then ran on to sort of the carbon sequestration, carbon stabilization. And that's when the science team and Emily got involved and moved what I was dabbling at to a whole new level.
I want to come back in a minute to the effect that it actually had. But I mean, Emily, why is this supposed to work? I mean, I'm trying to think, it must be 20, 25 years ago, I interviewed a guy, and I have a feeling it was in Perthshire, who was promoting something that back then it was called remineralisation, and it was basically powdered marble that they were putting on the ground. Why does this improve the soil?
Well, I think there's still quite a few unanswered questions with that, Mark. But basically, you're putting the minerals that you're almost kind of building soil again, but you're putting those key minerals back into the soil. So the product that Alex has been using is basic silicate rock. So these are volcanic rocks, and more commonly, or you may have heard of them as either basalts or dolerite. So it's actually been dolerite that Alex has been using. But yeah, basically you're putting these important minerals back in. So you then allow the weathering process to happen. And because it's quite fine, because it's crushed, that weathering process can be sped up a bit. And this is what releases some of these minerals. The most important mineral in that rock or the most abundant mineral is silicate, but the next most important ones are the calcium and magnesium that are in there. And as they weather, some chemistry happens and they bring carbon dioxide in. So that's where the carbon sequestration part happens. And then potentially, as Alex suggested, there's other minerals within there which are also of potential value to our agricultural system. So as Alex was talking about, there's sort of cobalt and zinc and other things that are potentially valuable too. So looking at it from a farming point of view, there's a potential win-win within this. It can help sequester. Now, this is inorganic carbon rather than organic carbon, which we're probably all more familiar with, basically because it's geological rather than biological. But also, if we can see differences in production by adding these minerals, then it's a kind of double tick, a win-win.
Every so often in my professional career, I've become aware of the fact that I have skipped a question, which is kind of a key question. And I'm going to ask you both this question. Define soil. Emily, for a start. What is soil?
Soil is the living, breathing, functioning resource between our feet that the world requires to function, basically. And it's what supplies, for us, it's what supplies, and the whole of biodiversity, it's what supplies our food, our clean water and oxygen. It cycles carbon. So it's a pretty important resource.
Okay, and Alexander, same question to you. What's your take on it?
Soil, in essence, is four major elements. It's 45% mineral, it's 25% air and 25% water, then there's 5% organic matter. So it's a living biological entity. It's maybe best compared to the rumen of a cow. It needs everything to function in balance for it to be able to function itself. We spend a lot of time compacting soils, so you're pushing the air out of them, so they're not able to breathe. Root depths get challenged with compaction. We then can't haul in the necessary amount of water we need or rain. One of my primary focuses is in building organic matter, because that is the living biological entity that's in the soil that makes the air, the water, and the minerals plant available. So we are focusing really hard on removing any chemistry from our farming practice, because a huge amount of that is very detrimental to the living microbes, nematodes, protozoas, fungi that make the organic matter active within the soil. So when I'm increasing organic matter in my soil by 1%, I'm allowing my soils to hold an extra 250,000 tonnes of water per hectare. So there's a massive value in looking after and understanding the component parts of what soil is.
And if you're worried about compaction, do you actually roll your parks coming out of spring?
Not any longer. No, we used to grass harrow, we used to roll. We don't do it. When that frost lifted, and we've had a real belter of a winter this year, as everybody's aware, and some of the ground now is quite kind of spongy. There's been a massive frost heave, and there's quite an aeration in the soil. When you walk across it, it's like walking on a big sponge. You're not sinking into it, and you're not hard on top of it. It's really quite a strange and interesting feeling, and I think that's just the levels of compaction, or the small levels of compaction, just heaving a bit with frost, and that's particularly what frost is meant to do in a way.
Is that something you're familiar with, Emily?
Completely. You do feel a difference, and you can also notice it having. I mean, I've been a few times on Alex's farm, but even at home on the farm as well, you definitely feel that difference. It doesn't feel like you're walking on concrete. It feels like you're walking on something with a bit more give in it. And it's, as Alex says, it's so fundamental, because it means there's oxygen in there, there's space in there, there's space for these microbes to survive and to be able to function within your soils.
I'm fascinated by this idea, Emily, of you're feeding the microbes and everything under the surface of the soil, rather than trying to feed what is grazing on the top of it. One will follow from the other.
Absolutely, it will, and I think it's been the slightly forgotten part of our farming systems, pretty well post-war, is that there's huge value. And I think as ruminant farmers as well, we have a pretty good grasp of, a lot of ruminant production is actually about making sure you're feeding the rumen microbes properly, and it's not really any different, Mark. It's just about making sure that we're keeping these microbes functioning as well as they can, because they offer so many services, so many benefits to us and to our farming production system. So they're really important for cycling nitrogen and phosphate and potassium, and they're cycling the carbon. And it's a fundamental part. And I think this is also why we're seeing so much more renewed interest, because that understanding of how soils function is really improving.
You were saying, Alex, that you had taken a 12-acre field and you had spread it with different densities of this quarry dust. What was the end result? What happened?
It got a bit greener on year one, was what happened. And I think that's some of the silicate in the product locking up a bit of atmospheric carbon on the surface and feeding the plant slightly better. The other thing we found was around cowpats and various things, the pasture regrowth around cowpats, the leaf shape and leaf architecture of the plants were far, far bigger, far stronger. The other thing we've found as we're going forward is these how you describe the product, these fine particles, which are maybe a couple of millimeters squared. They are now between 5 and 7 centimeters down inside the soil profile. So they haven't actually sat on the surface. They've actually migrated their way down through the soil profile itself, which I find really interesting.
How does that happen?
I think we're not entirely sure. I wonder if worms are moving them around.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
There's a lot here, Mark, that we don't quite know yet. There's a lot of cool stuff we've found out, but we're working with an ancient material which soil effectively formed around 4 billion years ago.
How do you go about, Emily, working out what the sort of root architecture is of plants? Presumably you have to dig them up.
Well, we have a pretty good understanding of different root architecture of different plants, and there's certainly plenty of resources available for farmers to have a look at. So we know that some grasses have shorter roots than other grasses, but we also know that in particular the forbs or the herbs, as you'll increasingly hear them referred to. So this is things like plantain, chicory, and other pasture species that we have in there have a slightly different root system. So they've got much more taproot. So it goes deeper, it's narrow rather than the broad branching grass roots that you can see. And even within the grass species, we know that there's different root structures. So yeah, we don't necessarily need to have a spade to understand the architecture, but it's always useful actually if anybody is out and about on their farm is just to take a spade and just to see, because how your soil, and we would talk about compaction earlier, that can influence how plants can manage to fully express their root systems. So it's really important stuff.
Why is it necessarily a good thing to have deeper roots, Alex?
The deeper the roots go, the more carbon you're dropping down to deeper levels in the soil. You've got a greater ability to feed soil microbes, and you're also allowing water to infiltrate down these root systems. You have more worms moving around up and down through the profile, so you're building a far greater resilience into the soils. Carbon is very easily lost. I mean, it doesn't take much to damage soils, and carbon evaporates, which is really your organic matter, evaporates back out of the soil. And also, it's a great means of managing water, and that's the biggest benefit that we've seen, is that when we are getting a lot of rain, we're able to push a lot of that moisture down through the soil profile, so we're not getting runoff, so there's no nutrient leaching. And then when we're hitting really dry spells of weather, the last couple of years have been ridiculously dry for 6 weeks or so, we're actually pulling moisture through osmosis back out of the soil. We've the roots down 2 to 3 feet now, and the ground there is still quite tacky, so we're pulling that moisture back up again.
What's really important about the root system as well is that plants basically pump carbon into the soil via their roots. So that carbon that comes through the roots is actually feeding the microbes. So there's a bit of a carbon trading going on between the plants and the microbes, because the microbes can start to access minerals that the plants need. So to have that different root architecture and different root depth actually allows carbon to find its way into different parts of the soil and allows you to have a better microbial function. So these microbes can scoot off and go and find all these necessary minerals that are required by the plants.
In my experience, Alex, farmers tend to be conservative with a small c. You describe yourself as cynical. I mean, they take some persuading sometimes. So when you started dabbling with us way back when, how did your neighbours view you then, and how do they view you now?
They probably view me now as then as slightly nuts, but maybe just a capital N now.
But if this system is working for you and your productivity of your farm has increased because of it, I'm surprised that they do think you're nuts.
I think there's a couple of big points tied into that, Mark. If you have spent your professional career running a business a certain way because that's how you've been told to manage it, and these are the products that you have to buy to make it work, and there's new knowledge and new kids on the block come charging along saying, no, this is not right, mate, try and do it this way. You've got to have a pretty big, long, hard look in the mirror to realise that your life's work and what you've dedicated yourself to is maybe not quite what you thought it was. So, this is about information transfer at a super speed. The industry is now collectively under a bit of pressure. Carbon is a global topic these days, and we've all got to play a part in it. So Dad would be in the camp of, this is how I've farmed for 40 years, and for him it was a major adjustment to think differently. So I don't think that the farmers and their ethos and their culture is necessarily wrong. It is just, this is the knowledge that they have, and this is what they see and deem to be acceptable. I think it's a very delicate point, and it's got to be handled correctly.
I mean, Emily, the reference there was to the new kid in the block. Is it the new kid in the block, or is it a very, very old kid in the block? Are we going back to an old way of farming?
Farming itself is a system, and it's a system that's reliant on biology. So in a way, it's not surprising that a lot of what we're looking at is actually a method that has been used prior to the increase in chemicals that we've seen in agriculture kind of post-war. And I mean, it's fascinating because, I mean, Alex, as you'd mentioned earlier, was involved in rotational grazing with QMS actually as a grazing group host. And that method of rotational grazing has been known about for a lot longer than when Alex became a grazing group host member. So sometimes looking back isn't a bad thing to take us forward.
Yeah, and again, going back to this quarry dust, or I don't know what the proper term for it is, but it's essentially that's probably what it looks like. How expensive is this stuff, Alex? How easy is it to get hold of? What do you apply it with?
We've applied it in a couple of different forms. We've put it on through GPS lime spreaders, and that gave us the precision we needed on the early days. We've applied it on just with a normal lime spreader, set the rate to roughly 5 tons a hectare, and off you go. Or more laterally, actually, because of its power to work with and harness microbes in the soil, we've actually been mixing it with the dung and trying to aerate it and build it into more of a sort of composted form. And we've applied it out the back of dump spreaders at a ratio, roughly a 10-to-1 ratio, so 10 tons of dung to 1 ton of rock dust. And some of it we've got sitting, and it's been middening now for about 18 months. And when you break into that midden, it's super fascinating because what worms are always need to compost and break that down. That's their life's work. But you get far greater colonies of worms around the seams where the rock dust is in through the dung.
Which would tend to go back to your idea that the fragments of rock are being taken down into the ground by the worms. The worms like them for some reason.
Yeah, there's I think there's definitely an attraction there. I mean, some of this takes a little bit of believing. You've got to sort of see it to believe it. But I think there's a real attraction there, and the worms are getting something out of it. I mean, they themselves are an utterly fascinating creature, and what they do to soil health and increasing the calcium in soil is quite mind-blowing. So there's something going on there, which I haven't quite got to the bottom of it yet, Mark, but anecdotally and through seeing what they're doing, there's something definitely going on.
I think as well that just even water infiltration could also possibly be taking some of these fragments down as well. But it was a slight surprise at the project as to being able to find these fragments at that kind of depth, even after 3 years after application. So again, new knowledge quite often ends up with us having more questions, and certainly that was one of the things that we found with this project is that it's actually opened up a whole lot more questions having used the product and looked at what impacts it has had, and that's certainly one of them is how is this product getting that to that kind of 5 to 7 centimeters within that period of time.
And just reprising those two questions too, Alexander, as well, how easy is it to get hold of this stuff and how expensive is it?
It's roughly about £28 a tonne delivered, so it's equivalent to probably lime. And then you got your sort of standard spreading costs after that. It depends what your contractor's rates are for that. There's maybe a variation on the charge price depending on how far you are away from the quarry. So haulage got a big part to pay in it, but it's not nuts expensive.
You've been experimenting with this, Emily. What did it actually do to what you might describe as the wildlife within the soil?
Within the project, we looked at all sorts of potential impacts that this product might have, and that was on the soil and on the plants themselves, and also in terms of carbon storage. And the most significant change we saw was actually in the soil microbiology. Quite complex analysis where basically, because there's billions of bugs within our soils. And this test in particular was just looking at the bacteria and the fungi. And basically to look at it, they just test DNA. And from that DNA, they're able to give us an indication of these kind of teams of microbes, the function that these microbe teams undertake. So what we found was that there was an increase in teams of microbes who were able to sequester carbon, also teams of microbes who were able to mobilize nitrogen and mobilize potassium and phosphate. And also there was more microbes who would actually attack pathogenic bacteria and nematodes. So you're kind of getting a lot more good guys in the soil is what we're finding. So it's having this effect of providing you with a slightly better microbiome, a more functional soil that potentially has these benefits. And we also found as well that there were for some pathogenic species, there was less of them in the soil. So that was they're actually species that are more relevant to arable farming, but blackpoint and ergot and Fusarium crownrot. So there was less of those species present. But as Alex says, it really starts to open up all sorts of additional questions, because we then think, well, actually, what benefit would this project have then on a different farming system? So Alex has put it onto a grassland system where some of these bacteria and bugs and things aren't necessarily an issue for his production. What if we were to try it on arable systems? How does it work under different soils? There's still a lot of unanswered questions. And also, I suppose most importantly, how do we value this? What's the real value in this improvement in the microbiome? And that's quite a hard thing to measure. And it's also some of the things that we're starting to grapple with in farming as we potentially are moving in a direction of, how do we value carbon and all these other effectively ecosystem services? How do we value them? And can we even get to the stage of putting almost like a financial value on them? But it's fascinating stuff, and it would be great to do a little bit more work and just see where we're at. And I think it's really important as well that I mentioned, we've only taken a snapshot of the changes that have happened on Alex's farm since applying this product. So he deployed it 3 years ago, and we've only been looking at it, or the science team have only been looking at it since July. We were only a very short project. So have we missed some things? Is there more to happen? There's some pretty big questions in there.
Absolutely. And the beauty of this project has been the sort of breakdown in barriers. Not that there maybe wasn't many, but it's opened doors to a greater communication between the farm gate and what the science guys actually do, and working alongside these people. It's just been brilliant. Their insight, science insight's been phenomenal at a farm level.
Big thanks as well go to the science team who were involved in this project on Rockwell Farm. So that's Carla and Ehsan from Abertay University, that's Alex from Dundee University, that's Matt from the James Hutton Institute, and Alex from the Jülich Research Centre in Germany as well. So they were the science team and responsible for doing a lot of measuring and recording on the farm. And
also a big thanks to SOPA. They've been the team or the organisation which has helped facilitate the project and allowed it to run. Without Debs and her resource, we wouldn't have managed to have made this project work. And Emily has also been amazing in keeping everybody to task and on track. So thank you to all of them.
No, I think it sounds absolutely fascinating. I'd love to come and see it in person at some stage. Alexander Brewster and Emily Grant, thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week, we're going to be looking at the best way to turn out youngsters in the spring. Until then, I'm Mark Stephen. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. For news and to listen back to previous episodes of the podcast, visit qmscotland.co.uk. For Scotch beef, Scotch lamb and specially selected pork recipe videos and inspiration, visit www.scotchkitchen.com or follow Scotch Kitchen on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter.